All right, the number's starting to slow down there on the sidebar. So I will begin this evening's presentation on behalf of the Lexington Historical Society and the Lexington Minutemen. I would like to thank you all so much for joining us this evening for a virtual lecture about the latest book by Nathaniel Philbrick, Travels with George. We were very lucky to be able to host Mr. Philbrick on his research journey for this book a couple of years ago. And we are also very fortunate to have a fellow historian and Lexington Minuteman, Nathaniel Forman, here to lead our discussion this evening. Before we get going, just a couple of quick housekeeping rules. We are recording this program, so if you cannot make it for the entirety of the program, it will be available later on YouTube and Lex Media. If you have any questions during the course of the program, down at the bottom of your screen or potentially at the top if you are using an iPad or other mobile device, you will see a box for a Q&A. So if you have questions for either Mr. Philbrick or Mr. Forman, we ask that you leave your comments down there so that they're visible. But you can also have a chat on your own on the chat window on the sidebar as well. And I will be monitoring that and relaying questions at the end of the program. So to begin, I'm going to spotlight both of you so that you are more visible. There we go. All right, thank you so much for joining us, both of you. And Sam, why don't you get us started?
Okay, just to say a few words about myself. I'm Samuel Forman. You had mentioned that I'm a modest historian myself. I had the privilege of meeting Mr. Philbrick while he was researching his book, Bunker Hill. And as a biographer of Dr. Joseph Warren, got to share that in some detail and feed that into Mr. Philbrick's research, which he's notoriously thorough at. My most current book is called Ill-Fated Frontier, about the American West in this exact time frame that we'll be talking with Mr. Philbrick about. Tonight, I'm privileged to represent the Lexington Historical Society, and I'll just say a few words about them. Number one is our appreciation for all of you who have tuned in tonight, because part of that was to make a donation to the Historical Society, for which we are very appreciative. And although this past year and a half to 2 years has been very troubling, the Historical Society has been very busy preparing for the after times and offering exciting programs like today, in part with the funds that you've so kindly donated. For those of you who are not from the area, we do hope that you visit. There are several historical sites that are magnificently reconstructed. The Hartwell Tavern, the Buckman Tavern, the Hand Clark House, all of which have important Revolutionary War associations and very informative exhibits at those locations. And I won't say much more about the Lexington Historical Society, but you have to suffer through some good words about them. I also told Mr. Philbrick that we would castigate him gently with a wet noodle, because he went through many geographies, which we'll talk about today. But some of the things about Lexington that he mentioned, that he missed a lot of our high points. So of course we'll slightly hold that against you. But at any rate, let's talk about Mr. Philbrick and his work. First of all, I think he's probably familiar to most of the audience who tuned in tonight. A very well-known and beloved historian whose works go across a wide swath of American history, adding unique perspectives, starting earlier with Mayflower for 17th century history. More recently, 3 books in a trilogy about the Revolutionary War. He's written about the American West in the 19th century, The Last Stand. He's also contributed Tragedy of the Whale Ship Essex, and is a big promoter for folks to appreciate American literature through reading Moby Dick. And one of his titles is about why we should read Moby Dick. And quite a number of other titles, which I won't go through in great detail, except to tee up what we're going to speak about tonight. Traveling with George, a different approach in some ways to his previous works. And we'll have Mr. Philbrick himself talk about what it's about and how's it different.
Well, Sam, great to be with you virtually, and love your backdrop. And folks, he's actually at the Lexington Historical Society. That is not a virtual background, and it's great to be talking to the Lexington Historical Society and the Minutemen. Lexington did play a prominent part in our travels, and yes, I'm guilty as charged when it comes to not necessarily giving every town, especially yours, the full historical credit you deserve. I write narrative history, and as a consequence, things have to be left out to make the narrative work. So my apologies, but I have to say that the folks at the Lexington Historical Society could not have been more helpful and welcoming, and thank you to your terrific staff. Now, how the heck did I come to write this book? I was finishing my third book about the American Revolution, In the Hurricane's Eye, about the year of Yorktown, with a focus on the naval battle that made that victory possible. And I live on Nantucket Island, an island 30 miles out to sea. Although I did grow up in that nautical center of the universe, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a unusual interest in sailing. And believe me, if you want to be a sailor in Pittsburgh, you have to travel. And so by the time I was 16, I was driving all over the country, really, with my sunfish on the top of my VW Bug, in search of sunfish races. I love the sailing, but I love the travel as well. And on Nantucket, it's an island 14 miles long. It takes 25 minutes to get from one end of the island to the other. Long road trips are not anything you're going to experience. And so I missed that. And, I had spent this, In the Hurricane's Eye was my 12th work of history. I've been doing this for 25 years, heavily researched books. 75% of my time is research. If I wasn't in the archive somewhere, I was in my basement office. And I was getting itchy, to tell you the truth. And yet, after my third book about the Revolution, I was becoming increasingly fascinated with George Washington. I really didn't see it coming. Washington, in my youth, was someone I sort of made fun of as that marble man. But I had discovered by the end of my Revolution series that he was anything but. And so I really wanted to find out what happened to him next. Well, it was a late inning research trip to Providence. Washington visited Providence several times during the Revolution. And I made my way to the John Brown House. And in the annex of the John Brown House is John Brown's chariot. And if we could cue up that slide, that would be great. And I was looking at this slide, and there it is. And there is the chariot. It's got in Travels with George, I compare the one seat, forward-facing seat, to the size of the back seat of a VW Bug. It's tiny, and there is a tradition that when Washington visited Providence as president of the United States, as the newly inaugurated president, John Brown took him for a ride in this chariot down to the wharf at Fox Point, where Brown was constructing a ship that was going to be named for the new president. And this got me to thinking, what was Washington doing as president, visiting Providence? And that's when I began to learn that when Washington became president, he realized he was the leader of an already divided nation politically. The Constitution had deeply divided the country into federalists who were for the Constitution and the strong federal government it created, and anti-federalists who believed, who distrusted the creation of a strong central government and believed the states should retain the power that they had formerly had under the Articles of Confederation prior to the Constitution. And in fact, when Washington was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789, in the temporary capital of New York, two states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, had not yet ratified the Constitution. They hadn't participated in his election. So he realized he needed to do something to create a sense of nationhood. And adding to this was the fact that states at this point really saw themselves in local terms. When the governor of Virginia said "my country," he meant the state of Virginia, not the country. Washington needed to do something. And so this was before a mass media. He couldn't get on the television and speak to the American people. He needed to go out there and visit as many towns and villages and cities as possible, and create a sense of nationhood out of 13 essentially independent states. So he went on a series of road trips. He began with a tour of New England in October of 1789, not even 6 months into his presidency. And he didn't go to Rhode Island because Rhode Island had not yet ratified the Constitution. But by the end of this journey, and he traveled not in a chariot this small, a little slightly larger, but not that much bigger. And he visited more than 60 towns in New England. He would eventually go on the most ambitious tour. He would hit all 13 states. The most ambitious tour would be the Southern tour that would take him all the way to Savannah, Georgia. It would take him 3 months. And so by the end of these tours, which occurred during the first 2 years of his presidency, he had gotten as far north as Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as far south as Savannah, and succeeded in creating a sense of the fact that there was something more than a state, a village. There was the United States of America. And so I said,
Nat, could you share your notion as to where the idea came from? Was it purely his own, or did he have some family or advisors tell him? Because it struck me that the first tour wasn't really a tour. It was traveling from Mount Vernon to the then capital in New York. And that was sort of intrinsic, a trip that he would be doing. And so to capitalize on that, to meet the public along the way, was something that was presented to him, even if
Yes.
it wasn't an idea. But some of the later tours, there were some significant things going on that you point out about negotiations with the Creek Indian chief, McGillivray, and trouble in the West, and just a number of issues that were happening at the same time, where there could have been an argument for George staying at the Capitol and staying close to these things.
Absolutely. I mean, and the idea seems to have come from him. And Washington was someone for whom travel had been a part of his very being from the beginning. When he was a surveyor in the Western Virginia in his teenage years, as a soldier in the 7 Years' War, he traveled as far north as the Great Lakes and as far west as the Ohio River, and then as a general, he was crisscrossing the nation. And so he immediately realized there's a great danger for the president. And remember, he's inventing the office of the presidency. There's a great danger of becoming isolated, of losing touch with the people it is your job to lead. And so not even a month into his presidency, he writes a letter to his vice president, John Adams, saying, would it be a good idea to go on a tour of New England and to start the process he would ultimately complete? And Adams says, yeah, that could be good if you have the time. And other cabinet members, including Alexander Hamilton, say it's a good idea. The point is made that if you go to New England, you have to go to the South. But this was really something that came from Washington, who felt he needed to hit the road if he was going to spread the gospel of the United States of America. And so I learned about this and thought, wow, what if I followed Washington's travels? What if I retraced his footsteps? And one of my favorite books of all time is John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, in which he famously heads out on a tour of the country with his standard poodle Charlie by his side in search of the meaning of America. And I thought, well, what if I do my John Steinbeck imitation and head out? And my wife, Melissa, had just retired from her job as she had been an attorney, but was now a leader of a nonprofit on Nantucket. She was about to retire. Melissa was going to come with me, and we had a puppy, Dora, a Nova Scotia duck tolling retriever. And let's go to the image of Dora in the rear view mirror, if we can. There's Dora. There's Dora. And so Melissa, Dora, and I, let's go to Melissa navigating. There's Melissa navigating, headed out following George Washington. When Melissa did not have one of these maps on her lap, she had Washington's diary. He kept a diary during his travels, so we know where he went, and it was really very amazing to pull into a town visited by Washington, read what Washington had to say, and be there. It was really something. And so what I liked about the idea this would be a way for me to get out of the office, see the country I'd been writing about for all these years, with every one of my books, I try to do something different, whether often in terms of narrative. And this one would be a real narrative challenge where I would interweave Washington's journey with our journey. And there would be some memoir in it, and so it was travelogue, history. And so it was a really fun book and challenging book to write. And so it's a different book. This is not one of my standard histories, but it was a great project, both as travelers and for me as a writer.
I have to say that it's a delightful read, and you make it look effortless. The locations have pride of place as you go from place to place, tracing George Washington's trips, but you jump around seamlessly from your own experience in the present to memoirs of yourself, and then George Washington during the travels, and George Washington during the Revolutionary War, and then significant personalities that he runs into along the way, that he often seeks out, that are associated with these geographies. And you make it look easy, and it's very enjoyable. So,
well, it was fun, and thank you, Sam. And and one of the fun things for me was the visual side. And let's go to N.C. Wyeth, the Wyeth mural. This is a mural painted by that wonderful illustrator / painter N.C. Wyeth, of George Washington's visit to Trenton, New Jersey. It was, and what was unique about his visit to Trenton, and this was during his pre-inaugural tour, when he's going from Mount Vernon to New York to be inaugurated. And here, Trenton was the scene of two very dramatic battles during the Revolution, and one of them occurring at a bridge. And over this bridge, they built this this arch of flowers. And by this time, Washington had developed a kind of dramatic technique where, before he entered a town, he would get out of the horse-drawn carriage that was transporting him, get on his great big white horse, there you see him there, and then ride into town. and in his general's uniform. And so this really was, this, if you go to a political rally today, it's huge screens and rock music and everybody's going crazy. Well, it began with George Washington riding into town on his great big white horse. And here you see it. It's wonderfully captured by Wyeth. And obviously idealized, but it's Washington knew he wanted to make an impression. And after 8 years as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, he knew how to do that. And he knew that according to Jefferson, he was the greatest equestrian of his age. And that's saying something in the late 18th century. And so he used that to try to create a sense of national pride. But on the other side, he was the leader of a republic. He was a citizen just like everyone else. And already the anti-federalists were accusing his administration of being dangerously monarchical. And so one of the things he did to try to dispel that notion was he made the decision to stay in public taverns. And, he was not going to stay in the homes of his rich friends. He was going to stay in public taverns. And, public taverns in the late 18th century were the equivalent of roadside motels. It was not a fun experience. It's a good thing there wasn't TripAdvisor, because his diary is one long lament, food terrible, beds worse. He didn't enjoy it, but he felt it was necessary to broadcast a kind of dual message. Hey, I'm your leader, be impressed, but I'm also one of you. And so it was a tightrope act that Washington was playing.
Now, Nat, you point out several times in the book how impressive Washington was on his charger. It's like a one-person parade, I think some contemporaries have mentioned. The horse was impressive. He himself was much taller than average. I think you mentioned that a horse and rider were 16 hands high, which is pretty high in equestrian world.
Yeah.
Do tell me though, we are very interested in the canine aspects of this story, and it comes up quite a bit through your own Dora and the perhaps mythical George Washington's dog, Cornwallis, who may or may not have existed. But the horses themselves, were they Revolutionary War veterans or the descendants of them?
I cannot answer that with any certainty. It depends. By the Southern tour, he was on Nelson, which I think was post-revolution. But I cannot speak with any certainty to these. But Washington loved his horses, and when it came to his white charger, he would, he pampered these things. He would, and to make them look as slick as possible, they would be painted with this white material, and then that would be cleaned off so that they would just glisten. They would be as white as whiter than Moby Dick, and they would brush their teeth. I mean, everything. And so Washington really did everything to add. He was a veteran soldier and took great pride in his appearance, and it added kind of to the glamour of the office. And this is where Washington was unique. I mean, there was really no one of his stature in America at this point. There was really no other person who could have been that first president, because he was a Federalist for sure. He believed in a strong national government, and he was very pro-Constitution. But he was from Virginia, which tended to be more anti-Federalist than Federalist. And so he was someone who could embodied both sides of the aisle, if you will. And so I don't think there was a political figure in America that could have been our first president and been able to create a government that would last the political divisions that were about to arise later in his presidency.
During this first tour, I think you mentioned that George Washington wasn't aware, at least for a while, of the emerging schism between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, or if he was aware of it, he didn't apprise of its potential size. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, we think today that we've invented partisanship. It's clearly we're in the midst of a partisan phase in our history, but it's been that way for a very long time. It began with patriots and loyalists, and it's evolved. And with the Constitution, it was Federalist, anti-Federalist, which would become Federalist, Republican. And it's that two-party system has evolved over the years. And but in the beginning, Washington was very hopeful that it might be different, that politics could sort of be pushed aside, but he knew it would all, it would be a honeymoon kind of period rather than any long-standing thing, and it really concerned him. I mean, he was a very reluctant president. He really did not want to be president. Over and over again in his diary during that pre-inaugural trip, he says, everybody's going crazy everywhere he goes, but he says, soon they'll probably be just as angry with me as they are happy with me now, and all that, because he knew the divisions were coming. And yet he pushed forward, hoping to create that strong federal government that he felt the country needed if it was going to get on its feet. And one of the big things they had to do was surrender the debt the states had accumulated over the Revolution. And to do this, Hamilton, who was his financial secretary, decided that the government would take those debts and assume those debts, and it was called assumption. And this was many of the southern states had already paid, particularly Virginia, had already paid down their debts, and weren't happy with this. The New England states, which hadn't paid down, that were thought this was a good thing. And so immediately, as his policies come into focus, people are reacting differently, particularly geographically. And Washington has Hamilton in his cabinet. He brings on Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. And Jefferson comes from a very different place politically, where Hamilton looked to Great Britain for many of the example institutions that financially that the country would create, such as a national bank. Jefferson looked to the revolutionary fervor of France as embodying what was appropriate for America. And he really didn't feel a strong federal government was in our best interest. Initially, they were able to, tamp down those differences and work together in that first year. But by the second year, Jefferson was becoming increasingly frustrated by Washington's support of Hamilton's financial plans, and began to go rogue, began to actively cultivate the opposition. And so in his own party, in his own cabinet, this is happening. Not even George Washington could stem the partisan tide. It goes with being America. We're a country founded in a revolution. Each generation goes through its own revolution as the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that we're all created equal, are redefined. And it's messy, it's frustrating, it's sometimes terrifying, but it is how democracy works.
Just as an aside, Sarah, could you take down the picture now? I think people want to have a good look at our guest. Nat, I was really impressed with the number of formative policies that were going on during this time frame of these tours, which were Washington's first administration, starting, as you say, with the appointment of cabinet members, key cabinet members, but assumption of national debt, Hamilton's ideas for raising revenue, trouble on the frontiers with actually asserting sovereignty over the Northwest Territory, the capital, the location of the capital and its financing and construction. All of those had beginnings amongst those tours. Do you perceive, this is something that just reading your book suggested to me, although I don't know the answers, I expect you do, that the tours themselves, though perhaps conceived of by Washington himself initially as a public relations effort for the new government and central government, that these tours changed his views, policy views, one way or the other, about some of these big issues that were being initiated and pursued at that time by his administration, and in some cases by his nascent opposition.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you can see it evolves over the first 2 years of his presidency. But when he goes on his New England tour, he's still creating his cabinet. There really is no policies yet for people to react to it. And so the New England tour becomes more or less a, hey, George Washington's visiting, we're now part of a country. And yet he's talking to farmers as he passes. He's visiting manufactories, a woolen mill in Hartford, several mills in Massachusetts, which was already the tech capital of the country. And so, he's by where he's going, he's making it clear what he feels is important. And one of the things he feels important is technology. That if the country is to cut the cord with Great Britain in terms of its dependence on British textiles, it really needs to develop its own textile industry, and which is controversial in itself. Thomas Jefferson, for example, had famously said in a book about the notes on the state of Virginia that the factories of Europe were anti-Republican, that were not something America should have. Washington didn't believe that, nor did Hamilton. He felt this was something to be encouraged. And so, he's using these as a way to enact his policy in a way, just as presidents today will visit a factory or something like that illustrates this. But, by the time it came to his Southern tour, it was been 2 years into his presidency, and those policies of Hamilton's were coming into clearer focus, and they were very controversial. And so before Washington left, and there was, as you mentioned, there's also the creation of a nation's capital, what would become Washington, D.C., which was controversial in itself. And so, and he wanted to use the Southern trip to get that started. And so, even before he leaves, he hears that Wiley Jones, the former governor of North Carolina, said, although I revere General Washington, I would not invite President Washington to my house. The anti-federalist feeling is strong in the South. This is Hamilton has just put forward the tax on whiskey that will ultimately inspire the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. And it, by all rights, it should be happening in the South because, no one's for that. Washington proceeds on it and talks with people, and he claims in his diary that when people voiced objections, he would explain to them the reasoning behind these policies, and they ultimately agreed with him. He may have been whistling in the dark a little bit, but the fact of the matter is, when Western Pennsylvania went into rebellion. The South didn't, when you think it would have. And was this the Washington effect? Was this the influence of his policies? And as far as Washington adjusting his policies because of what he learned on his tours, yeah, I think it's kind of intangible. But I mean, the fact is, by the end of these tours, he knew the country about as well as anyone. I mean, he had actually been to these places, talked to these people, and so I think it gave him an ability to say, hey, I have some sense of where they're coming from here, and try to enact a policy that was as fair and as necessary as possible.
Well, he certainly experienced how bad the conveyances were, or really the roads and bridges, and sometimes lack of them. One instance strikes me where he, at least his horses, go overboard in a ferry across Annapolis. And of course, the roads are very rough and crude in a number of locations, particularly in the South. I don't recall Washington, though, as advocating road improvements. For instance, like the National Road is more 19th century.
Yeah.
Does that come up?
Yes, it did. And, and it was, what's interesting, by going on this tour, he almost shames the states into recognizing how pitiful not only their road systems are, but their system of accommodations. It's been said that Washington jump-started the hotel industry in America because people were deeply embarrassed by how, what pitiful places Washington was staying in, particularly when he went in the South. There were, he couldn't find taverns. They just didn't exist. So he was forced to stay in people's homes. And, at one instance in the South, he goes to what he thinks is a tavern and orders lunch. And they give this immense feast, and he only belatedly realizes, no, it's a private home. And, they've just gone, let out all the stops for him. And so it was a policy by which, and what you see is towns in anticipation of Washington arrival, doing public works project to just try to get the road better. I mean, and this is very, they're not doing anything special. They're just, keeping it from being an open ditch, and turning it into a road. And so, it shone a light on it. It was not it would be later where, it would become the Lincoln Road and all that. In Jefferson's, administration, there would be a real attempt to begin to try to create public roads. But I mean, there are public roads, obviously, but nationally improved roads. But it was definitely a big part of what he was doing, just by having the gumption to go out there and slog his way through there and showing, this is what I have to go through if I'm going to visit you.
You really have some visceral descriptions of travel as Washington would have experienced that I found very engaging. And although it's not a war book, it has to do with his first administration in peacetime, I was impressed that he did have some personal heroics just to make it go. You talked about how he had a very serious infection in his leg that would have impacted one of these tours, and that he was actually physically in pain for part of it until this got better.
Yeah, no, it was, one of the things that really surprised me was that how frail Washington was, particularly in the beginning years of his presidency. He was 57 years old. He had outlived every male in the Washington family for, in generations, which he described as his short-lived family. He really felt he was on borrowed time, and almost immediately, within a month of the presidency, he almost dies from a carbuncle on his leg. Had to be surgically removed. It was months before, he could walk in any good way. And then, he would catch the flu within the next year that would almost kill him once again. And at one point he writes that, between the lack of exercise and the stresses of the presidency, this could very likely kill me. But he determined that he was going to see the thing through. And one of the things I think that attracted him to going on this tour was that it gave him a chance to get out of the office, get out there, see some fresh air. It was good for his health, and it was. After every one of his tours, he was in better shape than he had been before. And he found remember, he is inventing the presidency. It's not only inventing it for himself, but for all subsequent presidents to come. At one point in the book, I say that to be haunted by the past is bad, but to be the first is to know the potentially unbearable weight of the future. And Washington felt that. It was highly stressful, and yet he went out there and took it on. And so, one of the things Melissa and I got really sick of by the end of our year and a half of following Washington was the phrase, "Washington slept here," that sort of historical joke.
Right.
He was not sleeping around. I mean, every one of these places where he had stayed represented another night in service of his country, whether it had been during the Revolution or whether it had been during these tours where he visited more than 100 towns and villages throughout America. And so it was work, but it was also the kind of work that I think saved him in kind of a psychological and physical way, because it got him out of the office during those stressful early years of his presidency.
Now, these tours themselves, at least aspects of them, have gotten into local lore all up and down the coast and his travels. A lot of these stories are apocryphal. You have fun with some of them. I was wondering if you might just comment on some of the more outrageous stories that are associated with these tours, and any that you think are offensive and should be erased or are just comical.
Well,
obviously, as some of these struck you, and there's some very interesting comments in the book that I don't want to be spoilers, but which one really stood out to you as just like totally wrong or should be?
Well, hey, I mean, oral tradition is one thing, things get repeated and changed with time, and they often reflect the time they're being told rather than when the time of when this event supposedly happened. And one of the ones is New England tour that we encountered in town after town was the legend of the Washington Elm. Every town had an elm tree that, according to legend, was this big leafy tree that Washington, in the midst of his toilsome journey, paused underneath the tree to refresh himself, gazed upon the beautiful village before him, wiped his brow, and continued on. And from that day forward, it would be known as the Washington Elm. And towns throughout New England have, a lot of them have died of elm disease or been knocked over in hurricanes or whatever. But the myth of the Washington Elm is a very vibrant part of many towns. And the thing of it is, when you examine it, the fact of the matter is these trees, Washington was traveling in October and November. It was cold. And many of the leaves were off the trees. He was in a rush too. He was just trying to get from town to town. He wasn't pausing anyway. But the real kicker is these trees were not the huge leafy trees that they would become in the 19th century when these legends were recorded. These were mere spindly things that Washington would probably not even noticed as he roared past in a cloud of dust. But they appealed to people knew that Washington had visited. And so the legend of the Washington Elm is a part of the town. And history is a many-layered thing. One of the things I loved about this project is how local the focus was for me in what is essentially a national story. Before I headed out, I reached out to the historical societies and libraries of just about every town Washington visited, and asking them, what do you have on Washington's visit? And it was terrific. I mean, from the Lexington Historical Society and other societies around the country, I was getting all this information, 19th century accounts of the Washington Elm, those kinds of things, newspaper articles, all of this stuff. Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local. All history is local too. And that's how I got into it. I live on Nantucket. I was curious about the history of my adopted home. And with this project, it was a way to, by visiting all of these towns, seeing it from a local perspective. There's more to it than the plaque, that Washington slept here. There is how Washington was remembered. And, there's some great stories of, people who were there in Oyster Bay, Long Island. Sarah, 8 years old, standing at the gate in front of her house. Across the street, they're building a one-room schoolhouse. Suddenly a man on a big white horse rides by. It's George Washington. Sarah watches as Washington gets off the horse, goes over to the men building the school. And, as you said, he's a big guy. He's 6'4", and he helps the men lift a rafter onto the roof, leads them in a chair and tips them. And, this is, and Sarah would recount this when she was in her 90s in Greenwich Village, New York. This is Washington, not the president, not the guy on the $1 bill. This is Washington, the traveler, the human being out there on the road, interacting with the people.
You mentioned several times in the book that a number of these local traditions include stories where the punchline is he was only a man.
Yes.
And you parse the meanings of that, and they have several layers. I wonder if you just want to share a few, because it shows up in many, many geographies, these stories, which may be apocryphal. I think you point that out. Some of them may be true. I guess there's always a kernel of truth, but that's the punchline. It's like, why?
Well,
what is that about?
Yeah, I mean, what we encountered in many towns was a version of a single, legend, let's say, or account, anecdote, where Washington comes into town, a child comes up to him and is awed by him, and Washington turns and says, don't worry, son, or whatever. I may be the president, but I am only a man. And, and that initially, when I encountered that, I said, oh, come on, that is too good to be true. But the fact is, these are repeated throughout. And this is not an anecdote that was registered, that was in the newspaper that could have, filtered it through. I think, ultimately, I think he was saying a version of this. I live on Nantucket. We had Joe Biden here over Thanksgiving. And at one point, a girl was, his motorcade was driving by. He got out to talk to a girl who had a stutter. And, he says, I am president of the United States, but I grew up when I was also a kid with a stutter. And it's a version of the Washington, I am only a man. And, it's kind of what being the president of the United States is about. You are a leader, but you are one of us. And so, I found that amazing to see that and thinking, wow, that's basically what George Washington seemed to be saying. And, and whether or not, inevitably this was recorded much later in the 19th century, often an older person remembering what they had seen or been told. And so, something will happen in the transmission. But such is the squishy nature of history.
Nat, you mentioned before, we talked about some of the emerging policy issues that were so foundational, swirling about at the time during these tours, from the establishment of the Washington, D.C. To national revenue type issues. But the one issue that we didn't talk about was slavery. Which right in the Constitution with the 3/5 compromise was problematic, even to those at the time, challenging. And Washington, you describe, I think, really quite nicely on both a personal and policy level, had contradictions of his personal views, national policy views, choosing when or even whether to raise the issue as president. I wonder if you might say a few words about that. And it certainly ties into modern reassessments of founding figures, including George Washington, some of whom were slave owners themselves, of how we would assess this kind of thing and what your impressions were, both of the experience during these tours, and then maybe jump ahead on how you thought about it as a modern observer thinking about this.
Yeah, well, one of the things I wanted to do with this book, I needed to delve into Washington's relationship with slavery, given where the country is today. Everywhere we went in the South, particularly, there was something going on with Confederate statues, and ongoing. In Richmond, when we were there, it was before those statues started to come down. But those issues were latent. I mean, it was happening. And so I wanted to get into, what is Washington's relationship to slavery? And, and one of the things I want people to hopefully come away with after reading this book is how far Washington traveled, not just in terms of miles, but in terms of as a human being. I mean, he became a slave owner at the age of 11 when his father died, and he inherited some enslaved people. But his relationship to slavery changed during the Revolution. When he realized his black soldiers were as brave and capable as anyone in his army, his closest ally during the Revolution was Lafayette, an idealistic abolitionist who would later claim that if I had known I was helping to create a nation of slavery, I never would have lifted my sword in the cause of American liberty, which is a pretty extraordinary statement. And, Washington began to realize that slavery was a pernicious institution that was not good for the work of his life, creating a union of states. Jefferson would record his statement that if slavery should come to divide this country, I will go with the northern part. That's Washington said that. And yet, even as and can we go to the slide of the Ona Judge advertisement? But even as he, and he would ultimately make the decision to free his own enslaved workers upon his death. And yet, even as he's making that decision, he is actively searching out one of his own, an escaped slave owned by the estate of Martha's dead husband, named Ona Judge or Oni Judge. And this is the advertisement they would put out when she escaped from the temporary capital, the presidential mansion in Philadelphia. She would flee to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in search of freedom. She would ultimately marry and have several children. And Washington, even when he is in the last year of his life, even when he is drafting the will with which he will free his own enslaved workers, he's pursuing Ona Judge. She would live out her life in New Hampshire. And yet, Washington is not completely consistent. He is a paradox, like all human beings, where he does not live up to his own aspirations. I don't think any of us live up to, are not what we know we should be. You can't, this is, he is not perfect. But I don't think this means that we disregard everything that he has done. I mean, he is fundamental to who we are as a nation. Without him, the revolution would not have been won. Without him, there would not be a country. And one of the things I think, yes, we have failed when it comes to the issue of slavery in this country. But the only reason we feel it's a failure is because we aspire to be better. That is the nature of this country. It was the nature of George Washington. And just because Washington wasn't perfect doesn't mean we should turn our backs on what he attempted to create. The Union, that would be the same principle that would move Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 75 years later. And so ultimately, I hope, this for me, it's important to look Washington's role full in the face. And yet, I think it's also important to acknowledge his importance to who we are. He, more than anyone, I think, encapsulates our nation's tortured relationship to the issue of slavery.
Now, the story of Ona Judge would not have been known by anyone, I guess, except in Washington's inner circle at the time. There's a wonderful book out on it, incidentally, by Erica Dunbar, bringing this story to light is just fascinating. But in your book, you cited in the Northern Tour when Washington visits Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is, I guess, about as far north as he got, didn't get much further. So why did you choose to bring it up there?
Yeah, well, it's what my principle was geographical. As we're going through this, time is fluid in this book, and I also, one of the things I wanted people to realize is the issue of slavery. I think particularly Northerners see slavery as a North-South thing. In this book, I really wanted to show, no, it's not just North-South. It's an issue throughout the country, particularly when we got to Rhode Island. Rhode Island was intimately involved in the institution of slavery in the South. It is truly a national issue. And so for me, the narrative was a way to make all of these issues a part of the conversation from beginning to end.
Yeah, I believe the Portsmouth connection was that Ona Judge escaped to that location.
Yep, that's where she was. Yeah, and so that's where Washington tried to bring her back twice. And the first time he did it, he was still president, and he reached out to government officials in Portsmouth who reached out to her and did not end up cooperating with Washington's efforts. But, and so, I mean, because throughout in this book, Washington's relationship with slavery is brought up in the very early part and is throughout. And so for me, each stop was a potential touchstone for that issue, along with many others.
That fans of your description of sailing under sometimes distressed circumstances will not be disappointed by this book. Could you tell me a little bit about an episode which sounded almost lethal involving you personally and sailing, and how you fit this so seamlessly into this book?
Yeah, let's go to the videotape. When Washington ultimately did visit Newport, when Rhode Island and Providence, if we could go to the image of the crop Newport story, I think is what it says on there. Washington ultimately did visit Rhode Island after she reluctantly joined the Union, and he sailed to Newport from. Here we go. All right, keep going. Let's see, keep going. There it is. 14. He sailed from New York to he sailed to there we go. He sailed to New York, from New York to Newport. Melissa and I decided we would also sail to Newport, but from Nantucket. And we started, left Nantucket, spent the night in Edgartown on Martha's Vineyard, and we're smack dab in the middle of Vineyard Haven when our phones began to make that emergency distress signal, and it read tornado warning, seek shelter, and and we were initially, we had been worried about some thunder showers to the south, but so we put on our life jackets. I turned on the engine, began to take down the sails when, and this actual picture is not from that time. It's a heavy weather sequence from another encounter, but because we were not taking any photos in the midst of what would happen, because just as we were beginning to take down the sails, we heard the screaming from behind us to the north, and a gray wall of horizontal rain hit us, winds higher than any of us, Melissa and I, had ever experienced. I rounded the boat up into the wind. I won't go into too much detail because that's why you have to read the book. But for the next half hour, we found ourselves in the midst of winds that were clocked in nearby Vineyard Haven at over 70 knots. And it was absolutely terrifying. And it was, one reviewer has said it's metaphoric episode, speaking to how the tumultuous political situation we're in. But I wasn't thinking in terms of metaphors at the time. As I said to Melissa, it was really terrifying. And at one point I said to her, if we don't make it, everybody's going to say, well, at least they died doing what they loved. I don't love this. This is horrible. This is, give me a hospital bed and an IV drip any day. But we did survive it, obviously. And it was, John Steinbeck has a wonderful phrase where he says, you don't take a trip takes you. And in this instance, a tornado almost took us because it was a tornado that was passing just to the north of us. They could see the cyclone from Oak Bluffs. It would then veer to Cape Cod, ultimately ripping off the roof of a hotel in Yarmouth. So we weren't like Dorothy on our way to Oz, but we stayed on the water. But it was definitely the hairbreadth escape we didn't anticipate when we first departed from Nantucket.
Well, I will say to prospective readers that if you're expecting a sleepy travelogue, that's not this. There are episodes, sometimes unexpected, of excitement for George Washington and for the author. So you should read this. Nat, we've been going on for about an hour and it's in the evening. So I think maybe we should kind of bring things towards a close. I wonder if we will have time for questions and answers right after we're done our main talk. And I wonder if we can close, if I can prevail upon you to read from the book where it might summarize about how you have come to think about George Washington and what we might learn about this experience.
Yeah, if we could cue up the slide on Mount Mansfield. I'd thank you, Sam. I'd like to read from the epilogue. This is, we had talked about the division that would occur, political division that would occur in Washington's own cabinet. And even as Washington was finishing up his Southern tour, trying to unite this country, Thomas Jefferson and his Virginia ally, James Madison, went on their own Northern tour. Vermont had just become a new state, and Jefferson would write Washington, who was, in the midst down there in the South, saying that he and Madison were heading out for the good of their health to Vermont, and would be back soon. And what would be later learned was and they would they hoped to get as far north as Burlington, Vermont, sailing up Lake Champlain. But what would be later revealed that this was not just for their health. This was where they began to organize what would become the Republican Party. They would meet in New York City with Aaron Burr. They would have other political meetings in Albany and even Bennington, Vermont. And what made this, and so I decided Melissa and I had to go on one final road trip and retrace Jefferson and Madison's road trip to Vermont. And what made it interesting for me is I grew up in Pittsburgh, but we would spend summers. My father was an academic, had taught at University of Vermont before we moved to, so that he could teach at the University of Pittsburgh. We had a summer place on Mount Mansfield. And my brother, in fact, has a second home in Stowe, Vermont. And so during our following Washington, we visited my brother and went up to the top of Mount Mansfield and looked out upon Lake Champlain, which you can see in the distance here, and this. I will read now a section from the epilogue that takes up from that moment. Standing on Mount Mansfield at the end of summer, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness. Our travels with George had come to an end, just as the story of the new nation was beginning. Jefferson and Madison would return to Philadelphia and continue to organize the political resistance, confident they were battling the pernicious forces of monarchy and corruption. In the meantime, Hamilton and the Federalists, equally confident in their righteousness, pushed forward the financial program on which today's economy, with all its excesses and inequalities, is built. In the middle was Washington, a Federalist for sure, but a Federalist who recognized there was another point of view. What bothered him were not the philosophical differences between his two warring cabinet members, but their unwillingness to work cooperatively. Differences in political opinions are as unavoidable as, to a certain point, they may perhaps be necessary, he wrote to Hamilton. When matters get to such lengths, the natural inference is that both sides have strained the cords beyond their bearing, and that a middle course would be found the best until experience shall have pointed out the right mode, or, which is not to be expected, because it is denied to mortals, there shall be some infallible rule by which we could forejudge events. What both Hamilton and Jefferson needed, Washington seemed to be saying, was a little more humility and self-doubt, because no one, not even the two most brilliant men of their age, had all the answers. Unlike Hamilton and Jefferson, Washington didn't need to be right all the time. He just wanted to make things work. He understood that feasible change is not attained by righteous indignation. It's understanding that the road ahead is full of compromises if life is actually going to get better. Not Jefferson. When it came to his beloved French Revolution, he insisted that rather than it should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated. Were there but an Adam and Eve left in every country and left free, it would be better than it is now. This kind of philosophical dogmatism and melodrama was anathema to Washington. He had spent 8 years of his life doing his best to prevent the United States from succumbing to the divisions and violence that were about to consume France. He understood the darkness of self-interest lurking beneath the most high-minded ideals. And yet, despite his inherent skepticism concerning the human condition, he had abiding faith in the American people. Although we may be a little wrong now and then, Washington wrote to his former aide-de-camp, Jonathan Trumbull, Jr., we shall return to the right path with more avidity. Thomas Jefferson had written the Declaration of Independence, but had been left to George Washington to translate its words into something real, into something that might one day evolve into what the preamble to the Constitution calls a more perfect union. Thanks.
Thank you, Nat. There's a lot to think about there. And well, let me put in a plug for the book before we go to the questions. This will make your publisher happy. So this is Travels with George. That's the way it looks. I think, Nat, you'd agree that we should encourage our local independent bookstores. And there is a new one, I understand, Maxima Bookstore right here in Lexington.
Great.
I haven't heard of a new independent bookstore in a long time. And then in Concord, there's the bookstore out there as well. And of course, you could obtain this book on Amazon. Matt, let's turn it over to the Lexington Historical Society staffer, Sarah, to see if we have some questions that you might take up.
Thank you so much to both of you. That was wonderful. And I'd also like to put in a small plug. We have received a shipment of books at our own gift shop at the Buckman Tavern as well. So if you're stopping by, we are open on weekends throughout the winter. So if anyone has any questions at this point, feel free to drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom. And we'll get started with one that came fairly early on as we were talking about the myths of the presidential pets and the entourage that went on this tour. Someone was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about these horses. They thought that perhaps they were painted white.
Yes, it was, they weren't technically, it wasn't latex paint or anything like that. It was, a white paste that was applied to the fur, and it would they'd sort of, and they would ultimately that would be taken off, and it would give them that bright, fresh look, sort of, I think, the kind of thing you do like a tooth whitener or something like that. He would also paint the hooves black, so to work on that contrast. So these animals were really primped for the appearance. Yeah, and it was Prescott who was the one that got a lot of the publicity, particularly during his southern tour.
So a lot of effort into very deliberate visuals and posturing, even before the age of photography and what have you. He's striking a pose.
Oh yeah, and Washington was, this wouldn't be. John Adams had no interest in anything like this. John Adams, if he wasn't at the, in his office, presidential mansion office, he was at home in Braintree, trying to stay away from people. He had, no interest in theatrics and that kind of thing. Thomas Jefferson would never, really venture out and hobnob with people. This was something, or Madison as well. I mean, this was Washington. Washington was pretty unique, and yet he would establish something that modern political leaders realize you've got to do. When it comes to making that impact.
So it sounds like he was kind of doing both things. He was only a man, and I guess projecting that by staying at taverns. At the same time, he's wearing his uniform and marching into town on a white charger.
Absolutely. No, and it is, it's that tap dance. It's I'm hey, he comes to Boston, and John Hancock, the governor of Massachusetts, he's, before the Constitution, the governors were the ones with all of the power. And even though Hancock was for the Constitution, it was one thing to be for the Constitution. It was another to have to defer to someone else, particularly if you're John Hancock. If you've seen the Declaration of Independence, he had a little bit of an ego, and he invites Washington. Washington is making his way through Massachusetts, and Hancock invites him to come to stay at his mansion on Beacon Hill, where the State House now is. And Washington has to decline because he's staying in public taverns. And Hancock's response is, well, okay, well, will you at least come to dinner? And Washington says, that'd be great. And so Washington arrives in Boston, goes down Washington Street. It had just been named Washington Street the year before. And huge crowd, biggest party Boston's ever seen. They're going crazy for him. But no, John Hancock, he doesn't show up. And so Washington returns to his quarters and writes Hancock a letter. Since, you haven't shown up yet, I don't think I will be coming to dinner. George Washington. Hancock realizes he's made a miscalculation and writes back apologizing. Hancock realizes I may be popular in Massachusetts, but George Washington is the most popular man in the world at this point. And he apologizes. He said, it was the gout that was keeping me at home. I will risk everything but death but come to pay my respects. And so he has two servants carry him into Washington's tavern, where Washington's staying, his legs wrapped in red flannel, and says, welcome, George. I'm sorry it's taken so long. And Washington says, okay, I'll come to dinner. And so, today we think a governor it's almost laughable. Of course, a president outranks a governor. Well, that's only the case because Washington didn't accept Hancock's dinner invitation.
Great. Oh, we're starting to have a couple of questions coming in here. Joshua is curious. He noted that in your books, particularly in The Heart of the Sea, that you focus quite a bit on the importance of leadership and occasionally its failings in times of crisis. And he is curious how this impacted your view of Washington and his leadership.
Good question, Josh. Yes, you're right. I've been interested in leadership from the beginning. And I talk about this in the beginning of Travels with George. I gravitate kind of to the dark side of things, whether it's a tale of survival cannibalism, as in the Essex disaster, my take on the Plymouth colony takes us to King Philip's War, and things like that, and so I surprised myself, my interest in Washington. And by the end of the trilogy, I came to realize he was a great leader, but he was not a great general. He lost more battles than he won, but he was a survivor. I mean, and this really in many ways goes back to the Essex disaster. He outlasted the British. He outlasted Congress's attempts to undermine him almost at every turn. He just stayed in there and outlasted people and survived the revolution, and by that became the winner. And so and when you look at the presidency, it's a similar thing. Yes, he made some excellent decisions, forceful when he needed to be, conciliatory when he needed to be. And yet, he got blasted with this political divide that is erupting between Hamilton and Jefferson, is just the canary in the coal mine when it comes to the divisions that will overtake the country during Washington's second term. It was horrible. And it was, by the end of it, he was just disgusted with the partisanship of his day. It was just as bad as anything we have now. And yet he had survived and done what we'd done. And I kept wanting Washington to have that high five moment. Yeah, I've done it, and he didn't. There was always another challenge ahead, always a disappointment. He didn't have that feeling of, yeah, I nailed it. It's only now that we look back and have some sense of, what we owe him.
Yeah, I think that that kind of covers the questions we have coming in, and
Great.
this might be a good time to end. I do want to extend the invitation that when we have happier days, which I hope will be soon, that you will accept the invitation of the Lexington Historical Society, the Lexington Minutemen, and other organizations in this direction to come in person. We'd be delighted for you to come.
Oh, it'd be great. Lexington is Melissa and I just loved our time there, and it would be great to have a chance to come back. So, and Sam, thanks so much for this. It was great to talk to you all virtually.
Thank you, Nat, and have a great holidays. And for everyone tuning in, thank you for your donations and your attention, and we'll say good night.
Good night.